Welcome to the 16th webinar on cardiopulmonary products and cardiovascular surgery, anesthesia, and perfusion. On behalf of Specialty Care, I'd like to welcome everybody. My name is Al Stammers, and I will be co-moderating this session with my good friend and colleague, Craig Peterson. Craig is a graduate of the University of Nebraska Medical Center and serves as an area clinical manager for specialty care in the Midwest, primarily around Kansas City. To remind people, we run these webinars in a pattern that allows us to administer and grant Category 1 American Board of Cardiovascular Perfusion points. And in order to do that, we have several criteria that have to be met. The list on the left-hand side of your screen just shows what some of the logistical requirements are. Please stay in for as long as possible. Actually, today's session, we don't have to remind people to do that. It's going to be extremely exciting. And I will introduce our speaker in just a moment. And after you're in, complete that very short post survey that is presented. I think it's just 1 or 2 questions, and then submit it. The CEU certificate will be emailed out, usually within a week's time. But if you have any issues with that and you do not receive that, at the very end of the presentation, we'll have Craig and my email. Please email us and we'll make sure that you get that. Plus, it's going to be recorded and then placed on YouTube, as all of our sessions are, and also on the Perfusion Leader website. It will be posted there in a very short period of time as well. So just to remind individuals, we've been granted 1.2 Category 1 CEUs. Well, it is indeed my pleasure, before we get into the introduction, to go ahead and talk about how the discussion will be handled. The presentation will last about 35 minutes, and then we'll have a 20-minute Q&A session. And during that time period, please use the chat function of your Zoom sign-in. And as you see these questions start appearing, please go ahead and vote on them or like them. And as more likes come in, they get elevated to the top of the list for questions so that we can address those to the speaker. But as I mentioned, it is my honor to introduce a very good friend of mine from the Food and Drug Administration, and that is Catherine Wentz. Catherine has an extremely impressive background. She received her Bachelor of Science degree in Chemical Engineering from Penn State University, just down the road where I'm broadcasting from, as well as a Master of Science degree in Biomedical Engineering from Duke University. As with many individuals within the federal government, Catherine wears many hats at the FDA. She serves in the Division of Circulatory Support, the Structural and Vascular Devices, the Office of Heart Technology and Cardiovascular Devices, the Office of Product Evaluation and Quality, as well as the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health. She is a senior master technical reviewer, and she leads many projects through the technical and regulatory process at the FDA, and this includes all types of device applications, including PMAs. And Catherine's going to describe what a PMA is tonight in great detail. Her expertise transcends many disciplines. These include cardiopulmonary bypass, ECMO, autotransfusion, hypothermia, as well as heart failure. She is the recipient of numerous awards throughout her career, including the FDA Commissioner's Special Citation. And recently, in the Annals of Thoracic Surgery, she was a co-author on the paper Non-Tuberculosis Mycobacterium Infections Associated with Heater-Cooler Devices. So we are indeed fortunate to have Catherine join us this evening to present FDA Regulation of Medical Devices, Abridged and Simplified. Catherine?
Thank you so much, Al. Hello, everyone. I'll wait until the first slide comes up.
I apologize. There we go. I apologize.
That's okay. There we go. All right, so good afternoon. My name is Catherine Wentz, and I am an engineer and scientific reviewer at the Office of Cardiovascular Devices at the Food and Drug Administration. I thought what I would do today is break down the FDA regulatory process and specifically what we do behind the scenes for pre-market review to clear and approve devices for the market, and then what you can do as clinical professionals to help keep these devices safe and effective while they're being used in the clinical environment. Next slide. My presentation today will cover the nuts and bolts of pre-market review of medical devices, including how devices are classified, what is provided in a marketing application and needed for a comprehensive review by FDA, and finally, what the FDA review process looks like. Then I will discuss how users of these medical devices can help assure the safety of cleared and approved medical devices in the post-market space. Next slide. Next slide. To start, medical devices are put into classifications based on risk. There are 3 levels of classification that can be assigned to a medical device, and each class has a different level of control necessary to provide a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. Each of these classes is usually associated with a specific type of marketing application to FDA, which must be reviewed and either cleared or approved by FDA prior to being marketed. So, for example, most Class 1 devices do not require a marketing application to FDA. Most Class 2 devices require a pre-market notification or a 510K marketing application to FDA. And Class 3 devices require a pre-market approval or PMA marketing application to FDA. Next slide. Let's go into a little bit more detail about each of the different medical device classifications. So Class 1 medical devices are considered to have low risk and do not usually require a marketing application to FDA. Low risk medical devices include the characteristics shown on this slide. They are not life-sustaining or life-supporting. They are not for a use that is of substantial importance in preventing impairment of human health, and they do not present potential unreasonable risk of illness or injury. Examples of Class 1 medical devices include tongue depressors, medical gloves, and crutches. The FDA regulates Class 1 medical devices through general controls only. General controls are the basic provisions, including registration and listing, labeling, good manufacturing practices, and adverse event reporting that provide the FDA with the means of ensuring safety and effectiveness for this class of medical devices. General controls apply to all medical devices. Next slide. Class 2 medical devices are higher risk and usually require the submission of a pre-market notification or a 510K market application to FDA for review and marketing clearance as labeled. The FDA regulates Class 2 medical devices through general controls and special controls in order to assure reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. Special controls are regulatory requirements for Class 2 medical devices for which general controls alone are insufficient to provide reasonable assurance of the safety and effectiveness for the device, and for which there is sufficient information in order to establish special controls to provide such assurance. Special controls are generally a set of pre-market and post-market requirements that will sufficiently address the known risks for the specific medical device. Some examples shown above include specific performance standards, pre-market data requirements, and post-market surveillance. Special controls for Class 2 devices are usually device-specific and can be found in FDA guidance documents, national and international standards, and are outlined in a specific device regulation. Some examples of Class 2 medical devices include surgical sutures, contact lenses, and cardiopulmonary bypass cannula. Next slide. An example of Class 2 special controls is outlined in a medical device regulation includes ECMO. The ECMO regulation is defined under the regulation number 870.4100 and includes all individual components of the extracorporeal circuit, as well as an entire ECMO system. Specifically, this slide identifies the broad categories of special controls identified in order to address the known risks and to assure the safety and effectiveness for all potential ECMO devices when used as identified in the final order as a Class 2 medical device. The special controls for ECMO are shown on the slide and include physical and technological characteristics, biocompatibility, sterility, packaging and shelf life, bench studies, animal and/or clinical data, and labeling requirements. Next slide. Class 3 medical devices are considered high risk, including life-sustaining or life-supporting, are considered to have substantial importance in preventing impairment of human health or present an unreasonable risk of illness or injury. These are also those devices where general and special controls alone are insufficient to provide reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. Class 3 medical devices are therefore regulated through general controls, special controls, and additional information such as manufacturing controls and clinical data to support device safety and effectiveness, as well as any clinical claims made for the device. Class 3 medical devices require the submission of a pre-market approval application, or a PMA, to FDA for marketing approval as labeled. Examples of Class 3 medical devices include stents, heart valves, and ventricular assist devices. Next slide. This is an example of a medical device regulation which all of you are familiar with, non-roller type blood pumps. The regulation number is 870.4360, and this regulation is actually a split classification, which means that depending on the intended use of the non-roller type blood pump, it could be either a Class 2 or a Class 3 medical device. Both medical device classes in this regulation have a limited duration of use of up to 6 hours. However, the Class 2 non-roller type blood pump is intended for use during open surgical procedures, either cardiopulmonary bypass when used in a circuit including an oxygenator, or for temporary circulatory bypass for diversion of blood around a planned disruption. The Class 3 non-roller type blood pump is intended to provide temporary ventricular assistance due to immediately reversible alterations in ventricular myocardial function. Next slide. FDA has several regulatory submissions, all referred to by their acronyms. So what is a 510K? The term 510K refers to Section 510K of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that describes the application required to be submitted to FDA if a medical device manufacturer intends to introduce a device into commercial distribution for the first time or reintroduce a device that will be significantly changed or modified. Devices submitted under the 510K paradigm are required to demonstrate safety and effectiveness through substantial equivalence to a legally marketed device, also known as a predicate device, using general controls and special controls. It is important to note that devices are cleared for marketing under the 510K review process. Next slide. So what is substantial equivalence, or since FDA loves its acronyms, SE? The manufacturer who submits a 510K for their Class 2 medical device has to demonstrate that their proposed device and an identified predicate device have the same intended use, the same technological characteristics, and similar or equivalent performance characteristics. If the technological characteristics are different between the subject and predicate devices, and the differences raise new or different questions of safety and/or effectiveness, this will require that the 510K be found not substantially equivalent, or NSE. An example could include an invasive chemical means of controlling and monitoring a patient's body or core temperature, as compared to a topical blanket using air or water to control a patient's temperature. There are several new or different safety questions related to the chemical that would not be raised when considering a cooling or warming blanket as the predicate. If the technological characteristics are different but do not raise different questions of safety and/or effectiveness as compared to the predicate, and the performance data provided confirms equivalence between the two technologies, then the device can continue to be reviewed under the Class 2 510K paradigm. An example of this could be an oxygenator with polypropylene fibers versus an oxygenator with polymethylpentene fibers. A new fiber may raise questions of sufficient gas exchange, appropriate pressure drop, and hemolysis, but these are all the same questions that are considered for the predicate device as well, and bench testing can be performed side by side to the predicate device to compare performance and substantial equivalence. Next slide. So what is a PMA? A PMA is a pre-market approval application that includes all of the data necessary to determine safety and effectiveness for the Class 3 medical device using general, special, and other controls such as manufacturing controls and the submission of clinical data. The clinical data submitted in a PMA is usually from a prospective randomized controlled clinical study performed under an investigational device exemption, or an IDE, that is also submitted to FDA for approval prior to using the device in a research study in humans. Devices are approved under the PMA review paradigm. Next slide. So while 510Ks and PMAs are device marketing applications where FDA clearance or approval of these applications result in the ability to market a medical device under the cleared or approved label, there are three other types of applications to FDA that I will briefly go over. An IDE is an investigational device exemption that is required to be submitted to FDA when a sponsor wishes to utilize an investigational medical device in a clinical study. That can mean either proposing the use of a currently marketed medical device outside of its cleared or approved labeling, or proposing to use a new device in a clinical study. The clinical study is typically designed to produce the data needed to demonstrate safety and effectiveness for the investigational device when used as intended. And these resulting data are submitted in a 510K, de novo, or PMA marketing application in support of marketing clearance or approval. A de novo process provides a marketing pathway to classify novel medical devices for which general controls alone or general and special controls are known and provide reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness for the intended use, but for which there is no legally marketed predicate device. This process is a risk-based classification process, and the medical devices eligible for de novo can be classified into Class 1 or Class 2. Q submission is a submission that solicits feedback from FDA on specific questions that a sponsor may have when considering submitting a marketing application to FDA. Usually, the specific questions included in a Q sub are related to test protocols such as bench studies, clinical study protocols, or animal study protocols prior to initiating these studies. These submissions provide valuable feedback to the sponsor, as well as additional confidence that the FDA feedback, when taken into consideration, and the data resulting from these studies will address the performance and or special controls necessary for the intended IDE or marketing submission. Next slide, please. This slide presents a snapshot of the review process for 510Ks and PMAs. Very briefly, a 510K review includes an in-depth review of the device mechanics, indications for use, device performance, and labeling to demonstrate substantial equivalence in an appropriate predicate device. The FDA review period for a 510K is 90 days. A PMA review includes much more information as compared to a 510K, since manufacturing information also needs to be reviewed, and there's almost always animal and clinical data submitted in support of a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. The FDA review period for a PMA can vary depending on whether a panel meeting is needed and whether major deficiency letters are issued. But in general, the FDA review period for a PMA is approximately 320 days. Next slide. Once the 510K or PMA is reviewed, there are several final determinations that can be made for each marketing application. For 510Ks, the FDA usually completes a first round review within 60 days, and in most cases, an additional information letter is sent to the sponsor. The sponsor has 180 days to respond to the additional information letter, and the FDA then has the remaining 30 days to make a final determination of substantial equivalence, or not substantially equivalent. An NSE determination is usually based on a new intended use, new technology, or the fact that the subject device was unable to demonstrate substantial equivalence through comparative performance testing to the predicate device, or was unable to completely address the additional information within the 180-day period. For PMAs, the FDA may issue a major deficiency letter within 90 review days. The sponsor then has 360 days to respond. Once the FDA has all of the information needed to perform a substantive review, a final determination for the BMA can include an approval letter, which means that the device can be marketed, an approval with conditions letter, which means that the device can be marketed after certain conditions are met, or a not approvable letter, which means that the device cannot be marketed at this time. Next slide. So let's go through an example of the 510K pre-market process for a Class 2 heater cooler device. Early in the development stage, prior to testing, the sponsor may submit a Q submission with testing protocols and any specific questions they may have about their proposed protocols. The FDA provides feedback on these specific questions, usually within 60 to 70 days. The sponsor can continue to submit supplements to this Q submission with any additional questions or new protocols until the sponsor feels ready to submit the formal marketing application. Once the sponsor submits their formal 510(k) marketing application, the FDA has 90 total review days to make a final determination. As discussed earlier, this 90-day period is usually split into two review periods with a request for additional information around review day 60. The sponsor then has 180 days to respond with the additional information requested, and the FDA uses the remaining time to make a final determination of SE or NSE. Next slide. Let's take a look at post-market information now. Next slide. The medical device reporting, or MDR regulation, establishes the reporting requirements for device user facilities, manufacturers, and importers. This is a mechanism for FDA and manufacturers to identify and monitor significant adverse events involving marketed medical devices. Device user facilities, manufacturers, and importers are required to submit MDRs for events in which a device may have caused or contributed to a death or serious injury and for certain malfunctions. Next slide. So when has an event caused or contributed to a death or serious injury? These would include events where a death or a serious injury was or may have been attributed to a medical device, or when a medical device was or may have been a factor in a death or serious injury. This includes events resulting from failures, malfunctions, improper or inadequate design, manufacturer or labeling issues, or user error. Next slide. A reportable serious injury is an injury or illness that is either life-threatening or results in permanent impairment or damage to a body function or structure, or requires medical or surgical intervention to preclude damage to a body function or structure. Next slide. A device malfunction is reportable when the device either fails to meet its performance specifications or otherwise perform as intended, and the device is likely to cause or contribute to a death or serious injury if the malfunction were to occur. Next slide. A strength of the MDR data is that they provide a qualitative snapshot of adverse events for a specific device or device type. In addition, MDRs provide signal detection for rare, unexpected, and long-term adverse events. MDRs identify problems based on real-world use, off-label use, and user error, just to name a few. Next slide. There are a number of limitations to MDR data. MDRs are a useful but limited tool in post-market surveillance, and for that reason, they are only one of the multiple tools used for this purpose. The results of an MDR analysis provide a snapshot of the data available on the reports at the time the data is pulled. These results can change over time as new information is added by reporters and analyzed. There is significant underreporting of medical device-associated events. This underreporting can be due to multiple causes, which are identified on this slide. It is important to note that we cannot calculate rates based on MDR data because we don't have numerator or denominator data. In addition, certain device malfunctions may not meet MDR reporting requirements. Therefore, the lack of submission of MDR reports does not correlate with the lack of problems for a particular device. Also, there may be insufficient or inadequate information included in MDRs. In some cases, there's the inability to definitively establish causality on their own between a device and a particular clinical outcome. Next slide. So what can be done to improve MDR reporting quality and what details are important? The information captured on this slide is specific to any type of device or device problem that relates to both user facility reporting and manufacturer reporting. So for example, use the correct manufacturer name, brand name, and device identifiers such as serial numbers, model numbers, etc. In the event description, provide as much detail about the reported events, such as who, what, where, when, why, and how. Healthcare provider input is valuable. Provide details about the patient, procedure, and events leading up to the event and how it was detected. Also include patient outcomes and consequences. And if applicable, details about how the device did not function as expected. In cases of capital type equipment, the biomedical engineering department perspective may be useful. The more details you can provide will help to increase the quality of the MDR report and facilitates FDA working together with manufacturers to address emerging device safety or performance issues. Next slide. So let's look at an example of some post-market activities. Let's take that heater cooler device example from earlier where we stepped through the pre-market process. This post-market example is one I'm sure you're all aware of. Back in 2015, several events occurred at once to alert the FDA of a potential safety concern related to heater cooler devices and non-tuberculosis mycobacteria, or NTM, infections. While monitoring MDR activity, FDA noted a signal related to infections associated with the use of heater cooler devices. Simultaneously, the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control, or the ECDC, notified the US CDC of similar events occurring in Europe. And there was also a published investigation in 2015 suggesting a link between NTM infections and heater cooler devices used during cardiovascular procedures. FDA began investigating the signal from all angles, internally using our own labs to create heater cooler device operating conditions, speaking with state, local, national, and international partners to understand the scope of the problem, performing investigations of heater cooler device manufacturers, and when necessary, issuing warning letters, continued monitoring of MDRs for infections related to heater cooler devices, close collaboration with the CDC and other experts, etc. In response, FDA has issued 7 communications, held a panel meeting, and held several webinars and calls with stakeholders to keep on top of the issue and communicate what we know. FDA has updated the pre-market requirements for water-based heater cooler devices based on these events and continues to work with heater cooler device manufacturers to mitigate the possibility of infections. So as you see, MDRs play a critical role in making sure that marketed medical devices are performing safely and as intended. FDA continually monitors these reports and will act upon them when warranted. Next slide. And that concludes my presentation. And I want to thank Al for inviting me here today to speak to you all. Thank you for your time and attention.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Very succinct and to the point, and a tremendous amount of information that you presented today. And I'm sure there's many questions. I've jotted down quite a few. So let's begin. And Craig, if you don't mind, if you're able to, I'll read a question, then you read a question, and we can go back and forth. So I'll start and read the question that was submitted by an anonymous attendee. Catherine, his or her question was, historically, an oxygenator was a class 3 device. Why was an oxygenator down classed from a 2 to a 3?
From a 3 to a 2. Yeah, that's a great question. Right, that was a great question. So back in 1979, the medical device panel classified all devices, and oxygenators were originally put into class 3, as were many medical devices. When that happened, the FDA called for PMAs and had a specific date for many of those class 3 devices. However, there were many of those devices, including oxygenators that and centrifugal pumps, non-roller type pumps, that were not given a date to come in with a PMA. So they continued to be reviewed as class 3 510Ks. And over the past 2 decades, we have been taking, there were 150 some of those devices that were those we considered class 3 510Ks. They were class 3 devices, but still being reviewed under 510K. We took those 150 and we researched every single one of them. And to be specific with oxygenators and the question, over the decades that we had data on oxygenators, we gathered all of that data and we determined we had enough information to write special controls. So we were able to down classify oxygenators from class 3 to class 2. So they only had to be regulated with general and special controls, and they didn't have to go through the PMA process. I hope that answered your question.
That was very good, Catherine. That was a great presentation. We have another question here from an anonymous attendee, and it kind of, with Al and I, kind of hits home because when Al was my program instructor, I had a chance to go over to London and do some pediatric stuff over there. And when I came back, they were using stuff that I've never seen before over here, and I still haven't seen over here. So the question is, historically, an oxygenator was a class 3 device. Oh, no, sorry. The question is, do products manufactured in other countries go through the same process for the FDA approval here in the US?
Yes, they do. That was a simple one.
Maybe expand on that a little bit. I know Europe is using a little bit of different stuff than we have. I know a lot of people here in the States always claim that it's easier to use stuff over in Europe, and they get stuff. It seems like they get the newer technology quicker than we do. Is there any truth to that? Is there?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination on the European, how they review things. I do know that their process is different, and it's heavier on the post-market aspect. So I think it's faster for devices to get on the market, to have that pre-market approval over in Europe, but then they are able to take devices off the market post-market if things are going wrong. We put most of our emphasis on the pre-market side, make sure it's safe and effective first, so we don't have to worry about taking it off or reducing its, indications for use or anything. So we have a much heavier pre-market requirement.
Excellent. Thanks, Craig. Catherine, I'm going to follow up with that. One of the questions, it's kind of now picking on the FDA a bit, and you did a great job of explaining, the FDA really is a safety organization. You're protecting individuals, United States, throughout the world, actually, because it's the FDA, I think, serves as a wonderful predicate example that so many countries have followed. But the question that comes up here is the length of time that it takes either for a 510K or a PMA. And several times you presented that 90 days are utilized, as after the application is submitted. And we've heard in the field over years that usually that 90 days, day 89 or day 90 is when manufacturer for a class 2 device will receive a response from the FDA. And then it sets itself all over again. So that there's another there's another 90 days that goes on after the reply is received by the manufacturer. So the question that the individual is asking here is, what could be done to expedite the review process? And clearly this past 18 months, we've seen a lot of expeditions in regards to EUAs and COVID-related pharmaceuticals and devices. But what could be done from a cardiopulmonary perspective to expedite it?
Okay, so that's a two-part question. So first of all, I want to clarify the FDA review process is 90 days total. Clock never restarts. So when we get an application, like I said in my presentation, the first 60 days, we go through a substantial review and we review everything. And we give a very detailed letter. 99% of the time, especially in the cardiovascular space, you're going to get an additional information letter. Something has been forgotten, or something doesn't look right, or we have questions about something. So after that 60 days, and 60 days is the latest that you will get an additional information letter. It could happen anytime within that 60 days. The sponsor will get, the manufacturer will get an additional information letter. That sponsor then has 6 months to respond to that additional information letter, because it could be that they need to repeat some bench testing or do some additional bench testing that they forgot to do. So it's going to take them a little bit longer than our 60 days of just reviewing it. So they're given 6 months. then once we get it back, we only get that remaining 30 days to make a final determination. We aren't allowed to put it on hold again. Very rarely. If we've made a mistake somewhere along the way and we forgot to catch something, then we can put it on hold again. But that's very rare that that happens. So our review cycle is limited to 90 days. And at the end of that 90 days, if we don't have everything that we need, or not everything was provided, or it still doesn't look like it's substantially equivalent, it will get an NSE determination. Most of the times we work interactively with the sponsors in that 30-day period to make sure that we're getting everything that we need to try to get that to SE. So the second part of that question is, how can we expedite that? So the hardest thing for us, I don't think we can expedite the 90 days. Believe me when I tell you, my workload is crazy and 90 days is pushing it. What would help us is the Q-sub process. If you aren't absolutely sure of what is needed in the 510K for us to review, submit a Q-sub and ask, or even just pick up the phone if it's a simple question and call me and ask. The quality of the submissions that's coming to us greatly helps our review process. So if it's organized, if it has everything that we need, and it's well laid out, then we can go through it quickly, and that helps out greatly.
Well, if you don't mind, just for a sec, because what you said doesn't really make sense to what we see in the industry. According to your numbers, you have 60 days, 6 months, and 30 days, and assuming that all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed, that's under a year for a class 2 device, 510. Yet we often hear from the manufacturers that, oh boy, it's stuck in the FDA. We've submitted for 2 years ago, and this device is still there. So what would the manufacturer not be doing that would not fit into that time frame, which sounds very logical and very aggressive, but we often don't see that. We hear it's much longer.
Right. So what could be happening if the manufacturer is saying it's taking 2 years is they may have withdrawn the 510K. If they knew that an NSE determination was coming, they couldn't finish the bench testing within the 6 months or whatever, they could have withdrawn that 510K. And that is not public information. So they may not want to let you know that they did that. So they can withdraw they can withdraw their 510K and then resubmit. That's the only thing I can think of, because we are held to those 90 days, and we are held hard to those 90 days.
Excellent. Thank you, Catherine.
Yep.
Catherine, here's a question from Miss Gray, Marine Gray. And I think it's something that we all kind of wonder, and this goes back to even schooling, it was just something that we all saw in the IFUs, but what parameters were evaluated in determining the 6-hour limit of approval for oxygenators? Was it the manufacturers? Was it the FDA? Was it, as you spoke about, was it the bench testing? What exactly, 6 hours has been for 20 plus years now is what we've heard for oxygenators.
Right. So that was something I think I inherited 30 years ago. So I think it was something when I read back into the proposed orders and final orders of cardiopulmonary bypass equipment, 6 hours was thrown around. And I don't know whether that was clinical. It was probably a combination of, that's probably the longest time that someone would undergo a cardiopulmonary bypass, combined with the fact that the bench testing needed to demonstrate device performance on the bench with blood the blood can only stay viable for 6 hours anyway. So I think, it was just a combination of a bunch of things, clinical and bench, practical, that made that 6-hour time limit.
Gotcha.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to read a question from Bob our good friend and past editor of the journal. And Bob states the FDA sponsors a registry called MAUDE, a manufacturer and user device experience. How does MAUDE relate to a MDR, and what does the FDA do with MAUDE data?
Okay, you asked me something I don't know how to answer. That's a great question. I wish I knew that myself. Because we love our acronyms. I don't know how MAUDE and there's MedWatch, which I think is the way that patients can even submit. And so I think it's more, I think MAUDE is a broader, I could be completely wrong, but I think MAUDE is broader beyond the user facilities and manufacturers. I think it goes beyond that and includes patients as well. I will get back to you if you give me your email.
Oh, we stumped you. Great. That's what Bob.
He did stump me. But I'm serious. If you give me your email address, I will go to our MDR people and ask them specifically so I can get that answer to you.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Catherine. Greg?
I have a question here from Linda. Linda asked, the FDA approved cardiopulmonary bypass devices for use during ECMO therapy in April of 2022 because of the COVID epidemic. Is ECMO therapy now approved by the FDA overall? And if not, how can they approve devices for its use, but not ECMO itself, essentially?
So great question. So in April of 2020, because of the pandemic, the FDA had authority to expedite getting devices on the market that would help with the pandemic. Obviously, the pandemic is a respiratory illness, and ventilators were rare to find a ventilator. So ECMO was another way to help oxygenate the blood. And so we allowed through an EUA, which is Emergency Use Authorization. It is not a clearance. It is not an approval. It is the FDA saying you can go ahead and use these devices during the duration of the pandemic only. And what we did was we allowed the use of cardiopulmonary bypass devices, and there's a whole list in that EUA of the devices that were allowed to be used during the pandemic. Once the pandemic is over, those devices will go back to being labeled as they were originally cleared or approved.
Let me follow up with that too, Catherine, and I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but it's great having you present. We were all shocked that the FDA did that, primarily due to the pathophysiological consequences of COVID-19 and more recent research. You weren't aware of this at the time, but what we are seeing in the field and what's been published is the failure rate for FDA cleared devices for ECMO is several times larger than it is for any other ECMO population that's put on. In fact, 1/3 of all ECMO procedures, ECMO runs, undergo one or more total circuit changeouts. So in retrospect now, and again, I know you're not representing the FDA, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but knowing that the devices that have already been approved for or cleared for long-term use fail, 35% of the time, and the polypropylene devices, the oxygenators, is what Linda is really referring to primarily. Those, fail at a much higher rate than the ones that are made up of different substances. Is that something that you've given the EUA? Should it go back and review it and say perhaps that was moving too fast and in the wrong direction?
Right. So great question. And actually, the EUA, when it was being written, we did have somewhere in there oxygenators with PMP fibers only. But it was decided at the time, because it was that time that ventilators were being used up like crazy, and we didn't know what was going to happen, and we didn't have many oxygenators with PMP fibers at that time. And so we went ahead and opened it up, knowing, and we even had in the EUA, you must have in your labeling a very, very specific observations to look for in order to make sure that that device is operating properly. And if it's not, you need to change it out. So that was a requirement in there, since it was opened up to all oxygenators. We did not know what to expect as far as shortages with oxygenators after the ventilators were all being used up. So, but we did, that was a huge consideration. And it was originally written for oxygenators with PMP fibers only.
Thank you. And just as a little bit of aside, Catherine, we've seen in our registry, we have over 600 COVID ECMO patients that we've performed in the last 20 months. Our highest number of ECMO procedures just occurred in August, looking at the month. So every now and then we think we've hit, a trough and we're on our way down, and then we see a huge spike come up. And, there's a number of reasons why that may be occurring. But, we're definitely not out of the water yet when it comes to at least, the support of the severely ill. So, but anyway, Craig, I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, Mr. Headland out in Hays, Kansas. Catherine, regarding the NTM and the heater coolers, so when a heater cooler is approved for market use and release, what's the FDA's involvement as far as the IFUs in the as far as cleaning, disinfecting? Do they go over the protocol as far as how to clean it as well?
Great question. And up until 2015, no, we didn't. Cleaning and disinfection, since none of the the water in this heater cooler device, nothing was patient contacting. So we didn't even consider having to review the cleaning and disinfection information. It had to be in their labeling, and under the good quality systems, if it's in their labeling, they have to have had that validated procedure in their files. But we did not have to review it under 510K. After the NTM infections were known, that's a requirement. So they have to submit cleaning and disinfection in their 510Ks, the validated procedures, and aerosolization testing. Actually, I'm not sure whether they have to do the aerosolization testing, but a lot of times the aerosolization testing, if they can find that they don't aerosolize, that's a lot better and a lot easier than trying to do these cleaning and disinfection procedures. So what we are doing with all the manufacturers now is we are working with them to validate all of the cleaning and disinfection procedures in order to mitigate NTM now. So that's what we're working with them on, and that's not easy.
I'm sure that is a very difficult tour.
Catherine, I'm going to ask you a very specific question, and it's one that's being posed online in the chat room. And you may not know how to answer this, but it is a good one. It's something that we all fight with. This is from a pediatric perfusionist, and he or she is stating that that roller pumps are used quite frequently in the pediatric population. And these devices, of course, are, as you pointed out in one of your slides, these are roller pump devices. And they therefore don't have direct flow determinations, because what they're doing is they're dependent upon the lumen size of the tubing through the raceway and the revolutions per minute to determine the flow. So the question this person poses is, why isn't there a better way for those people who are using roller pumps to come up with an adequate, or excuse me, an accurate flow determination that the FDA could regulate?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I have not seen a submission for a roller pump in years. So I guess the technology is all with the microaxial pumps and centrifugal pumps. I've not seen any changes to the roller pumps. And I also didn't know, that's good to know, that roller pumps are still being used and a majority in pediatrics, she said.
Well, I don't know if they're a majority. Did I say majority? I don't. Bob Groom would probably know, and some other people on this, but they're used fairly often in the pediatric realm, more so than the adult realm, which I would say I'm guessing 60% are using centrifugal pumps versus 40, but those numbers are just my opinion.
So accurate flow rate is a difficult difficult thing with roller pumps. Yeah. I've not seen a roller, like I said, I've not seen an application for a roller pump in probably over 2 decades now, long time. Good question though.
Catherine, I have a question from Gerald. He essentially, when back in 2020, when everything got approved for ECMO, all we were short oxygenators and all this. What's the determinant? What's the stopping point? You mentioned that at some point it's going to change and it'll revert back. At what point? At what point is the stopping point?
Right, and I think that that's written in the EUA. And again, it's not approved, it's authorized.
Okay.
And it's something like when the health secretary determines that the pandemic, that the emergency is over. And that will be widely, discussed on national news and, whatever. And at that point, all EUAs that were authorized for the pandemic will no longer be applicable.
Okay.
We have a few more questions, some of them pretty direct. I think you touched upon it briefly, and obviously you couldn't go into depth. Here's one, again, from an anonymous attendee. How does the FDA evaluate preventive maintenance and cleaning guidelines during medical device approval? And this person did not state for heater coolers, but clearly disinfection and cleaning has been huge in that classification of devices. So how does the FDA evaluate the preventive maintenance and cleaning guidelines, say for the heater coolers?
Right. So now we do review all of that information. So they have to come in with a validated cleaning and disinfection process that supports what they have in their label, so that we know if the end user follows this, it will be it will do what it says. It will be clean, it will be disinfected, just like their validated procedure. Their maintenance is included in there. That's included in the process. So if they say that you need to change out the water every 2 weeks, that's part of their cleaning and disinfection process, and that's something that we review. So their maintenance schedule is, it kind of gets lumped in with their cleaning and maintenance procedures, cleaning and disinfection procedures. And we do review all of that now for heater cooler devices.
Is that for every device now, especially since COVID? Like even a cell saver machine, even any piece of equipment, is that getting the same scrutiny as a heater cooler, or is it?
Yeah, no, not for cleaning and disinfection. No, maintenance, yes. So if any of the devices has a maintenance schedule, they have to have data in their 510K that supports that maintenance schedule. So if they say that you've got to, replace X component every 6 months, it's based on durability testing that they provided to us that shows that it can last at least 6 months and probably starts going defunct at 2 times that. I think we're 1.5 to 2 times, the required maintenance. So any device that does have a maintenance schedule, we do review and make sure that they have data supporting that. But cleaning and disinfection is kind of unique to heater coolers, at least in my space in cardiovascular, because we don't generally have devices that you reuse or that you have to clean or disinfect. They're usually disposable, single-use, sterile devices.
Catherine, let me jump to your presentation. One of the items that you had talked about was the use of panels, experts who the FDA consults with for certain reviews. I'm sure you don't use panel. Well, I should ask the question, not that I'm sure, but what would be the criteria for putting together a panel for the review? I mean, is that automatically done for all PMAs, or how do you decide to bring in and consult with a panel for certain devices?
Yeah, good question. And it's on a case-by-case basis. If it's a first-of-a-kind device, it's going to panel. If it's I have taken things to panel before that is a significant health question. I think many, many years ago, I took hypothermia to the panel to find out what kind of data does the panel think is necessary in order to have hypothermia used in cardiac arrest. So anything that has a significant public health answer will be taken to the panel. The sponsor can, even if it's not a first of a kind device, the sponsor can request to go to panel. They may want the input of the panel experts. So that if they request that, then we can go to panel there. But it's generally done on a case-by-case basis. And like I said, the only ones that definitively have to go to panel are the first of a kind.
Craig, if I can follow up with this, and Catherine, again, you really pointed out something extremely important on a number of your slides, but one that I was really intrigued about was the lack of MDR reports, and that the fact that you don't have a number, that doesn't correlate with a lack of problems with the device. Yeah. So how do you communicate? Because the Europeans really were the first to tell us about the nosocomial infections that were developing from heater coolers. How does the FDA communicate with either the CDC or the ECDC, ECRI, as Bob had said, MAUD? Is there a channel for communications so that you're alerted sooner than later at the FDA?
At the time we had a group, and I forget, emergency EM, some group that does have direct communication to the CDC. And when we heard from the CDC, that's when we formed our group. We had already, as I said, this was all kind of happening simultaneously. We had already noticed the signals, and then this emergency group within the FDA under the commissioner was notified by the CDC and contacted us. And so that all kind of happened simultaneously. As far as currently now continued monitoring, we just pick up the phone now. We have our contacts in all those different areas, and we can just pick up the phone and call them, which is great.
That kind of goes to Mr. Groom's question here. It kind of piggybacks that and kind of correlates with it. He says, you mentioned in your presentation some of the shortcomings of the current MDR process. Do you think our industry will ever have a mandatory incident report system, kind of like aviation does right now?
So we do have, the MDRs are mandatory under certain circumstances if there is a death or a serious injury. Those are mandatory to be reported. The problem is the way, can you definitively link that serious injury or the death to the specific medical device? So that's difficult to do sometimes. So for example, in an extracorporeal circuit, if a clot was thrown, is it from the oxygenator? Is it from the pump? Is it from the cannula? Where is it from? So it's kind of difficult to make that specific determination where the serious injury came from. And like my presentation said, there are many reasons why the MDRs are underreported, but serious injuries and deaths are mandatory. So we do have a mandatory requirement.
Great. We have time for this last question here, and it's a comment from Aloy Lesh. And he has asked, so is the 6-hour limit on oxygenators set in stone?
For bypass, yes.
Okay.
Anything over 6 hours would be an ECMO indication.
Excellent. Well, Catherine, this has been wonderful. We've had a tremendous amount of questions here. There's a lot of kudos to you in the chat room. You're not going to be able to see them right now, but a lot of people from throughout the world, New Zealand and elsewhere, have complimented you on your presentation. So as of course, Craig and myself and all the organizers at Specialty Care. So I want to thank you. It was very thought-provoking, and I'm sure we'll have this on a future webinar again. I want to thank everybody for participating this evening. It was great to have you on board. I especially want to thank Craig Pedersen for going ahead and co-moderating this, and of course, Maggie Ring, who set this all up. We do have Catherine's email. She was kind enough to say that we can show this as she did in her slide deck. So if there's any issues, please go ahead and contact her directly or contact me and Craig, and we'll get a hold of her. So with that, I want to thank everybody for a wonderful evening and wish you all the best and stay safe.
Thanks, Al.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thanks, Catherine.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate it.